I wanted to extend a special welcome to Chika, who has come to join us tonight to present his book. I also want to extend a welcome to the work behind me by Anatsui, who inspired the book. And it's a great honor to have you here. And many, many congratulations to publishing this really major, major book on Anatsui, which has been in the making for so many years. I would also like to pay a tribute to the great, late Okwui Enwezor, who was such a crucial part of this book. I'm delighted that Chika has agreed to present the book, and I just want to give a few words of introduction. You probably all know Chika, but I'm just going to say a few words about him. He's a poet, artist, and curator, and associate professor of art history in the Department of Art and Archaeology and the Department for African American Studies at Princeton University. He's a member of the executive board of the program in African Studies and serves on the board of directors of Princeton in Africa. As a writer and scholar, he has received many awards and prizes for most important scholarly work in African studies and outstanding service to the arts. He's author of many books, and notably another publication he produced with Okwui Enwezor, which is Contemporary African Art since 1980, which was also published by Damiani. He's also co-editor of Chika, this Journal of Contemporary African Art, where I read this fabulous interview with Anatsui back in 1994, the first issue of that magazine. And he recently, 2 years ago, co-curated the extraordinary survey exhibition on Anatsui, together with Okwui Enwezor at the Haus der Kunst in Germany. There are so many more words I could add, but I really want to give the word to Chika now. Welcome, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here today to share a few words about this book project and the book itself, the small journeys that led to it. Okwui Enwezor, my dear friend and brother and colleague, journeyman and co-traveler, did not live to see the book, and that's a perpetual pain for me. But it's also that the reason to get this book finished and published has everything to do with the fact that that was a promise that I made to him in the last days, that I will get this book done, even though we're still at the beginning stages of it, at the time that he departed. But it's also that the book is a homage to my teacher, friend, studio master, colleague, Anatsui. Elle was my sculpture teacher in art school at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. He was my studio master when I was a studio assistant in his sculpture studio after my graduation. Then he was my senior colleague when I joined the teaching staff at my alma mater at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Elle became my friend in the process, a dear friend, and mentor in the process. And so the work that I have done over the years as a curator, critic, and scholar, a lot of it has revolved around Anatsui's work. As Elizabeth mentioned, the very first issue of our journal that we founded, Nka Journal of Contemporary African Art, in 1994. In that very first issue, I did a conversation with Anatsui. That was one of the first of platforms internationally through which many people got to know Anatsui beyond Nigeria. And in the 2013, I was having this conversation with Okwui about many projects that we were inventing. And Anatsui became a topic of our discussion. So what are we going to do about Anatsui? He knew that as an art historian, which is the other thing that I do on the side, for which I'm well paid by the university, that I wanted to do a book on Anatsui. And we decided, okay, we did the joint book that Elizabeth mentioned, Contemporary African Art since 1980. And that was it was a natural progression for us in terms of what we mapped out in 1993 as a way to transform, as we knew it, the art world such as it was at the time, with Salah Hassan, with Oluoguibe, and a number of others, but that core group, young, dispersed across the planet at the time. And that's how Nka began, as a platform for generating knowledge about modern and contemporary African artists, because there was no other place that you could go, and no gallery or museum would listen to you if you proposed to do a show on any African artist, except if they are community, libraries, and that's where you found African artists' work up until then, but not in mainstream galleries. And they will always ask you, where can we read about these artists that you're talking about? And of course, no one was writing about them. And that then meant you couldn't get a show for them. So that's how Nka began, as that initial project to generate knowledge about African artists. And that initial interview that I did with Anatsui was basically announcing that this is one of the artists that I'm going to be championing for the next several years. And so after we did the survey that was Contemporary African Art since 1980, the next logical project was going to be a book on an individual artist, because that was also the parallel path that we had been treading and walking curatorially. As many of us might know, and I'm gratified to see Mark Hudson in this room. And Mark is here. I met Mark in 1995 when we did a show at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, one of the first survey exhibitions that were part of this initial curatorial project of surveys of African artists. That was the only way to bring attention to what was going on the continent. That show was one of the first among several that came after. And Mark, I met Mark, and he wrote a profile on me. That's why I'm acknowledging him today. In the Daily Telegraph, this young kid from Nigeria came to do a show in London, and we connected this year, since 1995, right? And so Mark was one of those who sort of identified something that was beginning to happen. And so that exhibition, among others, there was a short century that Okwui and I co-organized, and Mark, who is here today, pretty much opened a lot of doors in terms of individual and collective projects. So these survey exhibitions opened a lot of doors. The next line of action was individual artists. Now that you have the attention of the art world, it's time to now begin to show in greater depth the work of individual artists. And so the curatorial project and the scholarly publishing project were going in tandem. And so Anatsui, both Okwui and I identified as one of the artists that we could do a monograph on. And that's how we began to talk about how to get about this. Okwui is, of course, a genius. I wouldn't have said this to him if he was, because we quarreled a lot. In terms of exhibition ideas. So while we were talking about doing a book, Okwui was appointed director of Haus der Kunst in Munich. And after I went to visit with him at the museum, and we were looking at gallery 2. There's this huge cavernous. And Okwui and I were walking through this gallery, and then he says, "Can you imagine hell in this room?" That's how a book project had to be set aside to focus on an exhibition. Because Okwui thought, let's do it now while I'm here. Well, he actually, there was a lot in that while I'm here. Because that exhibition opened a week before he died. And the book project had to be, kept in abeyance to get the project, the exhibition finished. He basically was waiting for the show to open. And so the promise to get this book done was a very solemn one for me. But it was also that if I didn't do it at this time, I wouldn't have paid the homage that I had been planning to do publicly to Anatsui. So that the coming together of these two aspects, right, of life and work is what produced this book. In the preface, I talk about, and in the very last pages of the book, I talk about this really difficult circumstance of beginning a project with Okwui, and he never collaborated with anyone in terms of publication. Okwui never did that. But we happened to understand each other at a certain level, and that meant arguing for hours on end about small and big things, and eventually finding a way forward, both for curatorial or publications. And so, thankfully, that mode of working together is what made this still a joint project, a co-authored book, even though at the time he died, we had barely begun to actually write. And I say this because every aspect of the book we had fought over, argued, settled, and decided what each chapter should be about in some detail across many years. And so at the time that he died, we had the amateur of this book ready. And so it took me a whole year and a half, even though we had a publisher that was really too aggressive to get the book out, because the exhibition had garnered a lot of attention, and of course they're in the business of business. So they wanted a book out right now. That was insane as far as I was concerned. I had lost a brother and friend, but they wanted a book, right? And so I set it aside for a year and a half. I couldn't possibly return to a book project that I started with Okwui. And so it wasn't until early last year that I guess the stars aligned, that I went back to the book, and within months it was done. And that's the book that you see here today. One word about what we tried to do in this book. Anatsui, everyone, a lot of people who have seen his work will tell you that they know Anatsui. After all, he's a bottle cap guy, right? Who made and who makes cloths, metal cloths, recycled stuff, right? He's a guy from Africa. They know about his uncles and family members and what they did in his village and all of that. But not so much about the work. Not so much about the ideas that motivated the work. Not so much about the intensely formal aspect of the work. Not so much about how the mode of making informs a theory of sculpture. In other words, Anatsui, in much of the literature that existed, it's not so much a sculptor of the moment, right? A sculptor of our time. He's an African sculptor who has happened to make it, and should be celebrated for that. And he makes work that reminds you of Africa. And so this is not a book in which we're interested in his biography, because that's pretty much what exists out there. It's almost always about where he comes from, with not a lot of attention, close, vigorous, rigorous reading of his mode of making, of his ideas about form, his ideas about color, his ideas about fragmentation, about a non-monolithic form. So this book is our attempt to try to understand what difference Anatsui has made in the history of sculpture. Because I think, and we believe and believed, that what people found attractive is precisely that, but it's often the case that they are hooked to his biography rather than the very thing that actually keeps his spectators in thrall. And so this is what we attempted to do in the book, and I had to cut ties with that publisher and go back to Damiani. Damiani was our publisher for contemporary African art since 1980, and is a publisher with whom Okwui and I were very comfortable in terms of allowing us to do what we want to do. From designing the cover to how it's copy edited. Because this is something that we have learned over the years, that in those minute aspects of knowledge production is where power lies. And we're not too willing to give that up. Especially after working so hard on any project. Someone else is not going to decide what goes in and what goes out. And so Damiani allowed us in our first project, and so that's why I went back to them to say, here's this book, manuscript project that I really want to get out. And they were too willing to work with me on that. And so in the months between September of last year and early this year, the book was done, and now it's out. And so this is really, for me, it's the most difficult project that I've had to do, but it's also the most satisfactory and the most satisfying. In the sense that I think that if Okwui were here, he would still argue with me, and I'll still argue with him, in every aspect of actually the final product. But that's how we lived. And so I hope that this is a project that he would be proud to see the final thing. At least I know what Elle thinks. He's around. I know what he thinks about the book, and that too is incredibly meaningful to me. Because he can have his opinion, right? And the one that he has about this book is an opinion that I'm extremely proud of. And so I hope that when you read this book, that you will get at least some idea about where we were coming from. And hopefully you'll get to learn a little bit more about the work of Anatsui. That's why we insisted on the illustrations. Because I promise you that you do not know Anatsui enough until you look at the images. Forget about the arguments we make, because we can argue about that. But I promise you that you will find images, you will find work that you did not know that Anatsui has done in his career. And that is important to us, that because the world knew and thought of Anatsui with regards to this brand of work from his late career, they had no latitude to actually understand where he was coming from, except that he came from Ghana. But where he was coming from, that is the project that we set out to do. And I think that we came close to that in the end. So, any questions?
Yes, please, if anybody has questions to Chika.
I've got a question. We just saw this work in the British Museum, and I noticed the dates were from 1998 to 2001, this piece of work, so that's 3 years of production. Is that typical? I mean, presumably he's got lots of pieces on the go and he's editing, and what's this process that causes him to work like that?
So the metal work at the British Museum, okay. Well, those were among the very first of his metal work. And it took him a while to understand the language of this form and technique that he was developing. So through the late 90s until 2001, 2002, he was still sort of meditating on this process, and this material. What would be the most appropriate language and form for it? And so that's why you have that. But beyond those initial works, you wouldn't find that kind of multi-year process for any of the works. Yeah. So that's why you have a 3-year lag time. L, for much of his engagement with material, he would bring in a material that he's thinking about exploring, and he would keep it for years before doing anything with it. I remember in one of my conversations back then, because we would go into the villages to collect old wooden mortars that had been discarded by their owners for processing palm oil, and collect them, bring them to the studio. And it was, like taking up a lot of space, right? And I remember, we are losing studio space, right? For these things that you're not using. And he said, well, they are not like goats. Like goats? I said, well, you don't have to feed them. Right? So you don't have to spend money, to feed them and care for them and stuff. Just leave them there. Right? So it took several years before any work came out of those wooden mortars. Right? The same thing with the bottle caps. It took him a long while to figure out what kind of method or technique or process could extract sculptural form from bottle caps, right? So that's what you have.
I think when L first came to England, he was making pottery.
Number, please.
And I've always just imagined, and he made a set of work that he had to go back to Ghana, or to Nigeria maybe, and he left it here and it was fired, and there was this show of L's work. I know that at the time L was fascinated by pottery, by this ancient craft of working in clay, that he could make things happen. And I've always wondered what would have happened, it's just a projection, if L had kept making pottery, in the sense that someone like Bernard Leach or some of the great Kawai Kanju, these Japanese potters, who spend their whole lives creating. Because you could see that in those early works, all the things that L later did were already there in embryo. And I know that a few times he goes back, he makes a few small pieces in clay and fires them. But it's almost as though these things took over. And I just imagine the show of L as a potter, as an African potter, what that would have been like. And it's a project in some stage to put that pottery back. And I'm hoping that your book does that. I know Olu wrote some very fascinating stuff on the early work.
Yeah, being a nothingness.
Yeah. But there was so much there, and it's as though L has just shoved off these whole careers. He just never bothered to, and moved to the next thing, and moved to the next thing, and moved to the next thing. And that's the thing that's never really said. And I think
hopefully you read the book.
That's what you're talking about,
right? Yeah. Hopefully you get a chance to read the book. Yes, L made pottery, right? But it wasn't just about clay. At the moment that he was working with clay, it was a medium that he relied on to explore form in the way that he was thinking about it at the time, right? Before that, he was working with wood, right? So pottery was not the first moment, right, of this experimentation with form. He was working with wood in Ghana. Came to Nsukka in 1975, and he didn't follow up with wood. Instead, it was with clay. And the critical narrative that we lay out in the book is precisely that, how he was thinking about form across media. So when you say he left clay, yes, he left the material, but the form and the aesthetic, that was the fundamental problem that he was grappling with, moved on to other material, right? So when he takes on wood, he made a few monolithic forms. It's the notion of fragmentation and fragility that if you look closely at the Venovi series that you're talking about, or the Broken Pot series earlier, it was this idea about fragility of form. Look at this, right? Look at what's behind me. It's metal. But you're not thinking about it as metal sculpture. Instead, you're thinking about the broken form. You're thinking about fragmentation and fragility. You're thinking about sculpture that is bought, right? Sculpture that veers towards painting, or painting that might be sculpture. Those are the kinds of ideas that he was exploring through clay at the time. And he returned to wood later, right? The work that Elizabeth and October Gallery championed, right? For years. That the same art world that is fascinated with this is much more reluctant to look at that early work because it's too African, right? So the book lays out these trajectories, but to point to what is important about what he was trying to do with these media, right? And that's what I mean by the fact that people who think they know his work, when you look at the book and the images, because it was very important that L went into his image archives, right? Work that had never been published before. No one had been interested in publishing anyway. That's part of the reason we did this book in the way that we did, in terms of really incredibly good images of his work, old and new. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I felt that you really expressed this idea of his terms and how he works with different materials in different transitional periods in his life. I thought it was absolutely brilliantly done in your book.
Thank you.
Really congratulate you for doing that. My question is about the cover. How did you choose that L. Hodge picture for the cover, or the L. Hodge sculpture for the cover?
Yeah, it's a detail, right?
Yes.
So that's the cover image. It's a detail of a series of work that he was making in the early 1990s, when he was grappling with broken and monolithic form. So these are freestanding sculptures made from wood fragments or pieces of wood. And this is after he had been working on wood relief made of multiple planks. And so in the early 90s, he was trying to figure out how to create freestanding sculpture from the same mode of making that resulted in the multi-piece reliefs. And Al-Haji is one of those works, and the other series that you call Wonder Masquerade. But it's also in that moment that you see glimpses of what will become the metal work in terms of the mark making on these wood sculptures. That the patterns of stitching and all of that that you see in the metal sculptures were already evident in the wood sculpture, that it was the mark making with power tools. And so when you look at this work, the top part of the shoulder, right, of this guy has these circles that sort of echo the circular bottle cap pieces that would be one of these major motifs. You know, a curveball, as the Americans say, that it's a way of an emphatic announcement on his status as a sculptor. And Earl always insisted about that, because one of the things that happened with the metal work is that, no thanks to the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, when they bought an early metal work and juxtaposed it with Akan textiles. And scholars ran with that. And so he was a metal fabric maker, Akan cloths, metal cloths, and people tended to forget that he was a sculptor. And that was something that was very important, not just to him, but to me as a scholar. Because rather than go the easy path of thinking about fabrics, you fold and hang, how about thinking about what it means to fold and hang sculpture? When we think about sculpture as of solid form, right? So this was an aspect of his work that we wanted to find a strange but important connection between these phases, these transitions across material. And that's what we're doing with this cover. Because if you look, since 2000, every single cover of catalog of Anatsui is this. And that inevitably made people forget, where he was coming from as an artist. And so this cover was a way of, pulling back that curtain. Yeah. So.
Chika, I want to thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful and illuminating, really illuminating presentation.
Thank you.
I also wanted to let you know that Chika's book is just behind you. You're welcome to purchase a copy, and Chika will sign them here at the table. Thank you.